Every day, more than 180,000 vehicles crawl along the Long Island Expressway, trapped in one of America's worst traffic nightmares. For nearly a century, one solution has haunted engineers and politicians alike: a bridge or tunnel linking Long Island directly to Connecticut. It promises freedom from gridlock and a new gateway to New England. So why, after 9 decades of studies and billions in proposals, does it still exist only on paper? The answer isn't just about money. It's a story of engineering ambition, political power, and the surprising possibility that this bridge might not solve anything at all. Every morning, thousands of Long Islanders face the same agonizing choice. They can either funnel through New York City's congested bridges and tunnels, adding hours to their commute, or take their chances on ferries that operate at the mercy of the weather and mechanical failures. The Long Island Expressway has become a symbol of transportation despair, routinely ranked as the second most congested traffic corridor in the nation after the 405 freeway in Los Angeles. The geography tells the story of this transportation nightmare. Long Island stretches 190 kilometers eastward from New York City, but it has no fixed road connection to the mainland east of New York City. Only ferries that carry a fraction of demand. People who wish to drive from Long Island to New York State's mainland or to any part of New England have no better option than to cross the Throgs Neck Bridge or the Bronx Whitestone Bridge, both located at the island's northwestern corner. The numbers paint a devastating picture of wasted time and productivity when you consider that Long Island is home to nearly 3 million residents, many of whom work in Manhattan or Connecticut. The daily migration becomes a massive economic drain. Drivers spend an average of 81 hours a year stuck in traffic, costing the region an estimated $1.9 billion annually in lost productivity. The 2 existing ferry services between Port Jefferson and Bridgeport and Orient Point to New London can barely handle a fraction of the demand. But here's what makes this situation truly disturbing. The solution seems so obvious. A bridge spanning the Long Island Sound could cut commute times by hours, not minutes. It could transform Long Island from an isolated peninsula into a true gateway between New York and New England. Yet, if this solution is so obvious, why hasn't it happened in nearly 9 decades of trying? The dream began modestly in 1938 when US Senator Royal Copeland proposed the construction of a 29-kilometer bridge from Orient Point, New York, to Connecticut or Rhode Island. Back then, the project seemed achievable, even inevitable, but as decades passed, each new proposal grew more expensive and ambitious than the last. Robert Moses championed the Oyster Bay Rye Bridge in the 1960s, a project first proposed under Governor Nelson Rockefeller, framing it as his final grand vision. But even Moses, who had built more bridges than anyone in New York history, saw his plans collapse by 1973. The defeat of Moses, a man who had successfully built countless bridges and highways, should have been a warning sign. The cost escalation tells its own horror story. In 1967, Governor Nelson Rockefeller signed legislation authorizing the Oyster Bay Rye Bridge and proposed another 23.5-kilometer bridge from Port Jefferson to Bridgeport, Connecticut. What began as a $368 million idea in 1967 had ballooned to $1.4 billion by 1979, $10 billion by 2008, and as much as $55 billion by 2018, turning a once plausible dream into one of the most expensive infrastructure fantasies in US history. The Montreal consulting firm, WSP, offered its prescription: an underwater tunnel, a bridge, or some combination of the two, with a price tag ranging from $8.5 to $55.4 billion. The most expensive option would create a 3-lane tunnel-only endeavor that would dwarf the cost of most countries' entire infrastructure budgets. And now it's up to $55 billion. That's staggering. When you put it in perspective of Connecticut's 30-year transportation plan, which was budgeted for $100 billion, said Norman Garrick, a civil engineering professor at UConn. But cost is only one of the monsters lurking in Long Island Sound. The engineering challenges of spanning Long Island Sound push the boundaries of what's physically possible. The most promising route, from Oyster Bay to Rye, would stretch 29 kilometers across waters that reach depths of over 30 meters. If built, this tunnel project would create the world's longest highway tunnel at 26 to 29 kilometers. One 2018 plan imagined something almost sci-fi. Cars plunging into a 16-kilometer tunnel, emerging onto a man-made island in the middle of Long Island Sound, gliding across a 9.6-kilometer bridge, and then diving back underground before surfacing in suburban Westchester. It would be the longest highway tunnel in the world, and one of the most complicated ever attempted. The ventilation alone presents enormous challenges. Unlike shorter tunnels that can rely on natural airflow, this massive structure would need ventilation capable of completely changing the tunnel's air every 90 seconds. One mayor whose grandfather designed the famous New York tunnels worried about air quality impacts, asking, "The feasibility study anticipates the western tunnel to ventilate at the two openings, with a ventilation shaft also on the Oyster Bay side. How will that impact our air quality?" The project would require construction crews working continuously for over 16 years, with approximately 6,400 man-hours of work spaced over a 3-year period, meaning an average of about 2,100 men working on the project, with a peak force of perhaps 3,000 workers. Every aspect, from foundation work in marine environments to the logistics of moving equipment across water, multiplies the complexity exponentially. Yet even if engineers could solve these challenges, they'd still face an enemy more powerful than physics itself. Ironically, the fiercest opponents are often the people the bridge is supposed to help. From Gold Coast mansions in Oyster Bay to affluent Connecticut suburbs, residents have crushed every attempt, wielding lawsuits, lobbying, and environmental arguments that mask a simpler fear: a flood of outsiders driving straight into their backyard. The pattern established itself early. Opposition to the bridge was beginning to form on both sides of Long Island Sound. In addition, plans to turn the Oyster Bay area into a bird sanctuary and a protected park made working on the highway harder. Faced with growing opposition, Governor Rockefeller cancelled the plans for the bridge on the 20th of June 1973, 9 years after the first proposal by Moses. The opposition transcends party lines in decades. Local officials have learned to package their resistance in environmental and fiscal responsibility language. Fiscal irresponsibility of this kind not only affects citizens who live in the North Shore areas, it impacts all New York State residents, declared Senator Carl L. Marcellino in 2018. Connecticut politicians show even less enthusiasm. "You don't start talking about putting a sunroof in your house when you've got a hole in the roof," said commuter advocate Jim Cameron, perfectly capturing the state's priorities. Connecticut officials view the project as coming at great expense while providing little to no benefit for Connecticut residents. The environmental arguments carry real weight. This is one of the most ecologically sensitive areas on Long Island that deserves to have all the protections that were won 5 decades ago, said Peter Quick, mayor of Mill Neck Village. The Sound's tidal wetlands, critical fish nurseries, and shellfish habitats could be disrupted by dredging and construction. These protected areas, ironically created partly to block earlier bridge proposals, now serve as permanent barriers to future development. But perhaps the most revealing opposition comes from an unexpected economic analysis. Here's the shocking truth that undermines the entire premise: the bridge might not actually solve Long Island's traffic problems. Transportation planners have discovered a counterintuitive principle that challenges everything supporters believe about the project's benefits. Transportation planners warn the bridge might actually make traffic worse. Every car that would go from Long Island to Connecticut would be offset by the car coming the other way, said Wayne Ugalik, a New York transportation planner, a textbook case of induced demand. WSP's own projections back this up. With a $7.50 toll, up to 113,000 new crossings wouldn't replace existing traffic, they'd add to it. Critics also point out a fundamental flaw in the design philosophy. Garrett questioned the proposal's lack of a rail or mass transit component, which he said would drive up traffic in Connecticut and encourage some rail commuters to take the roads. Instead of solving transportation problems, the bridge could worsen them by encouraging car dependency over more efficient mass transit options. The toll structure reveals another economic contradiction. Polimeni's plan was to charge a $25 toll to fund the private project, while recent studies suggest tolls between $7.50 and $20. Even at the lower end, these costs would make the bridge accessible mainly to affluent commuters, doing little for working-class Long Islanders who most need transportation alternatives. Yet despite all these obstacles, the dream refuses to die. In 2018, the Cuomo administration officially halted the Long Island Sound Bridge or tunnel proposal, with Paul Karras, acting commissioner of the State Transportation Department, announcing the project's end. Yet new proposals keep resurfacing, revealing a deep-rooted American fascination with this infrastructure dream. Despite past rejection, the idea remains alive in the public's mind. A Newsday and News 12 Long Island poll found 63% of residents favor a bridge connecting Suffolk County and Connecticut. The latest iteration emerged in 2021 when the North Atlantic Rail Project proposed a 26-kilometer tunnel from Port Jefferson to Connecticut as part of a high-speed rail line between New York City and Boston. This approach packages the idea within a regional transportation network to gain political traction. However, fundamental challenges persist: rising costs, stronger environmental regulations, and a lack of financial support from Connecticut and the federal government, which see little benefit in funding a project primarily serving New York. The Long Island Sound crossing has become like a perpetual motion machine, an endlessly attractive idea that reality keeps grinding to a halt. After 9 decades, the bridge that could transform Long Island has become something else entirely, a monument to American ambition, and to the forces that always seem to stop it. Maybe it's not a bridge to go nowhere. Maybe it's a bridge we were never meant to build. If you could decide the future of the Long Island Sound Bridge, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you're into deep dives like this one, hit like and subscribe. We've got more stories coming that challenge how we move, build, and connect.